Welcome back to episode 2 of One More Light, the life and voice of Chester Bennington. I am your voice, narrator, and storyteller, James Wolfe of AWM Studios Podcast right here on YouTube. This is episode 2. Episode 1 just got dropped. If you haven't heard it yet, go on my channel. Look up episode 1, listen to it. It is an immaculate story that I start to tell you about Chester's life. It's just a little snippet of his life, about 11 to 12 minute video. But take a look at that video, then come back here and listen to part 2 of this amazing story of Chester Bennington's life. Before he was the voice for millions, Chester Bennington was a kid with too many thoughts and nowhere to put them. Long before the world heard his screams of sorrow and strength, he was just a boy trying to find a way to feel safe, to feel seen, and to finally feel heard. Chester's childhood wasn't easy. In fact, it was filled with storms no child should ever have to weather. After his parents divorced, when he was just 11 years old, life began to feel unsteady for him. He lived primarily with his father, who worked long hours, often leaving Chester feeling isolated and emotionally adrift. And quietly, beneath the surface, there was a pain, much harder to talk about, something that stole his innocence and left behind scars far deeper than most would ever see. Chester would later speak out about being hurt by an older individual during those I'm stuttering and I apologize, but bear with me, I'm not perfect. So I will restart that. Chester would later speak out about being hurt by an older individual during these years. It was something he didn't understand at the time, and something that lingered like a shadow, affecting how he viewed himself and the world around him. But even in all that pain, Chester found an outlet, something that didn't judge him, something that didn't turn him away, and that was music. It started with the bands that he loved. Some of these bands, I'm going to be honest, I cannot pronounce, so if I stutter or if it doesn't make sense, I apologize. But bear with me. This podcast is not going to be a perfect podcast, perfectly polished or anything like that, so bear with me, but I still want to make it real. I still want to make it entertaining. And at times, I will give out my own viewpoints of the music that he's made as these episodes go on. This is meant to be nothing more than a tribute to Chester Bennington and everything that he stood for in life. So, let me continue. It started with the bands that he loved. Depeche Mode, The Cure, Stone Temple Pilots, the list goes on and on. These weren't just bands to Chester, they were lifelines. They expressed emotions he couldn't yet name. When the world felt numb or chaotic, music gave him order. Music gave him a voice. By the time he was a teenager, that voice began to rise. Chester started writing music, sketching lyrics in notebooks like journal entries with rhythm. He poured his confusion, anger, longing, and vulnerability onto those pages. He didn't want to scream just for the sake of screaming. He wanted to be heard, not just listened to. You see, Chester is like me in a way. Me and him battle with depression. I will be honest with all of you, my viewers, my listeners, whatever. I battle with depression on a daily basis, and social anxiety for that matter, where it is hard, and I mean extremely hard sometimes, to just get out of bed and do things. And I mean like maybe 20 times harder than a normal person, 20 times harder. And it's because on top of my social anxiety, on top of my depression, as you hear throughout the stories that I'm going to tell you and the readings I'm going to tell you, I stutter when I speak at times. And it gets to me. It makes me feel embarrassed to even speak. But I try hard. I try extremely hard not to let that bring me down. So I can relate to Chester within reason, with his depression and all. So yeah, I can relate to Chester Bennington with how he kind of felt being a teenager and young adult with depression. What I can't really relate to, sadly, is his childhood and the way he grew up and traumas that he had to endure, that I can't relate to. But I can say this. I felt sorry for him in every song he ever wrote, because when you're younger, maybe 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 years old, you just listen to music for the sake of listening to music and it's something you like. But when you're like 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, then you start listening to the music's lyrics and actually start reading into the lyrics. And that's what I started to do. In 2018, a year after he passed away, I started actually reading his lyrics. Like, I didn't just hear the lyrics, I was actually reading the lyrics and hearing his cry for help in songs like Breaking the Habit, in songs like Crawling, in songs like Bleed It Out, like all these songs, Numb, In the End, Somewhere I Belong. Like, if you actually read the lyrics, you can kind of hear what he was going through when he was writing the music. And it just really, really hurts me knowing the pain that he was feeling, that the rest of the world was just taking for granted because they just loved the music that Mike Shinoda was making on top of the lyrics. So, yeah, people sang along to his songs. Yeah, he had millions and millions and millions and millions of fans. But nobody was truly listening to the lyrics. They were just hearing it. They weren't listening to it. They weren't reading it. And it really hurts me and pains me that it took for his passing for people to finally see the hurt that he was dealing with. Anyways, let me get back to his story. All right? I apologize for that sidetrack, but let me get back to his story. At 15 years old, Chester joined his first real band called Sean Dowdle and his friends. Let me say that again because it sounded a little off key. Again, I'm just polishing this up to the slightest ability, and I'm releasing it as a raw podcast episode. So if I stutter, if I make mistakes, you're going to hear it, and I apologize. I don't have the patience to really go into depth as a audio engineer or something like that and actually polish it and cut out parts. So you're going to hear the raw files, and I apologize for that. But still, stick with me. Hopefully this turns out to be still a great show to listen to about Chester Bennington's life, okay? I'm going to start that again. At age 15, Chester joined his first real band, Sean Dowdle and his friends. It was a local post-grunge group based in Phoenix, Arizona. The name might have been forgettable, but for Chester, it was unforgettable. This was his first taste of what it felt like to belong to people. On a stage, behind a mic, saying something that actually truly mattered. Even at this early stage, his voice was something else. He had this haunting intensity, able to shift from soft vulnerability to raw, piercing power. A sound born from real hurt, but channeled with control. Even when the crowds were small, or the songs still rough around the edges, Chester gave everything he had, every single time. And then came Gray Days, the band where Chester began to truly shape his identity as a frontman of a group. Gray Days wasn't just a step up in music, it was a step forward in healing. He wrote lyrics that hinted at the trauma he was still processing. Songs about feeling broken, unheard, numb, but through that pain, something beautiful was forming. Honesty. Chester once said that music was like therapy for him, that when he sang about his past, it didn't hurt, it only helped him. It let him own what had happened, instead of letting it own him. Music became his mirror and his shield. It allowed him to connect with others, but more importantly, it let him reconnect with himself. Still, fame was far, far from reach. Chester was working odd jobs to survive, even taking a gig at a digital services company while still trying to make music on the side. Most people would have quit, but Chester didn't quit. Not because he thought he'd make it big, but because he had to sing. For him, it wasn't about the success, it wasn't about the fame, the fortune, everything that goes with it. It was about survival. And maybe that's why his voice resonated so deeply later on, because it came from someone who needed the music, not to impress anyone, but to stay alive. By the late 90s, Gray Days had built a local following, but Chester felt boxed in. He wanted to go bigger, to reach more people, to write about what he truly felt. Unfiltered, unpolished, and unapologetic. And soon, fate would call from Los Angeles, California. A demo tape, a chance audition, a new band with a weird name and even weirder songs. But that's a story for another time. Thank you for listening. In the next episode of One More Light, the life and voice of Chester Bennington, we'll explore how Chester went from a struggling Arizona musician to joining a band that would define a generation. Hybrid Theory, otherwise known as Linkin Park. Until then, thank you for listening and for keeping Chester's light still alive. If his music meant something to you, let it continue to echo. Because sometimes, the loudest voices come from the quietest pain. I'm James Wolfe, and talk to you all in episode 3 of One More Light, the life and voice of Chester Bennington. Good night, everyone, and see you all, or talk to you all, in the next episode. I just wanted to also add that I will be releasing these documentary podcast episodes either every Monday or every Wednesday of the week leading into July 20th, the anniversary of Chester Bennington's passing. So be on the lookout on my YouTube channel. Subscribe if you haven't subscribed yet. Like this video if you liked it. And click that bell icon so that when I do upload the next episode, you know exactly when and where to find my next episode. Right here on AWM Studios Podcast on YouTube. Thank you again. And enjoy the last few seconds of the piano version of Crawling by Linkin Park, otherwise known as the lead singer of the group, Chester Bennington. May he rest in peace.